One of the most common questions I get about Redux and Firebase is perhaps the most obvious one. How do they work together? How do we take Firebase and connect it to a Redux application? This question gets more interesting the more you research the topic. If you're using Redux, chances are you're also using React, right? So as soon as you type React and Firebase into Google, chances are you're going to land at React Fire, which is the official bindings between Firebase and the library React. This library is used to directly inject data into your components. This approach, of course, really flies in the face of Redux, which advocates a single store for all of our application data. So Redux and Firebase kind of seem to be at odds. Let's take a look at a diagram to illustrate why. When we're using Firebase and React, data is flowing directly from Firebase into React Fire and then into React. And Redux, over here on the far right-hand side, really has no idea what the current data inside our application is. This is not the greatest approach. Remember, Redux is supposed to be the source of truth for data inside of our application. Below here is a little bit better flow, definitely one that's more palatable. In this case, we have Redux, which is acting as an intermediary between Firebase and React. Notice how down here we're not making use of React Fire at all. Instead, we're using Firebase to inject data into our Redux store, which then passes data onto React. With this type of approach, the Redux application can also make AJAX requests to whatever other third party out there that we need to go fetch some relevant data. So let's take a look at an application which is going to kind of illustrate this approach right here, where we have React talking to Redux, and Redux is solely acting as the middleman between Firebase and React. So I've already got an application wired up, and it's a kind of a Twitter or blog post or whatever you might want to call it sort of application. Very simple, very straightforward. I have a list of currently hard-coded or client-side posts on here. I can delete a post if I want to. I can also add a post. So right now this is all client-side data. Nothing is being sent out to Firebase. We're not saving this to any exterior API. Let's take a look at the code for the project. Here's our action creators file. Right now, whenever someone calls the fetch post action creator, we return a very static list of posts right here. So we can see the text, one weird trick, and bet you wanted to read this. So those are the two static posts that we saw when we refreshed the application. So again, everything right now is client-side. The React side of the application isn't too interesting. It's just a series of different components to show posts on the screen and call some different action creators. And so they're not too relevant for our discussion right now. What's really interesting, or what's going to be interesting for our application, are these action creators. We need to somehow figure out how we are going to get data from Firebase into our Redux application. The interesting thing about this is how Firebase and Redux have a somewhat unaligned API. Let's take a look at a diagram to illustrate that. Redux works in a very well-defined or static fashion, almost linear. Of course, we can have async action creators, but nonetheless, the series in which we hit these different constructs tends to be pretty serial. We call an action creator, and usually that's going to happen by calling it directly from a React component. An action creator produces an action, which flows into our reducers, and then produces some new amount of application state. This is a very well-defined and certainly well-documented process of how to initiate a change or introduce some amount of new data inside of our Redux application. Firebase, on the other hand, has a very different API. With Firebase, we get access to what's called a Firebase ref or reference. And this is a direct reference to some of our data that's sitting inside of the Firebase database online. The Firebase data, or the Firebase ref, can, over time, emit a series of value events. A value event is Firebase's way of telling us, hey, I just received some new data over the wire. So on the Redux side of things, we have this very well-documented call an action creator that produces an action, flows into the reducers, blah, blah, blah. But on the Firebase side, we have this kind of wait and see approach where we set up this value handler and then we just kind of twiddle our thumbs and wait for some new data to come across over the wire. So we need some means or some method to integrate these two libraries together, these two very different ways of initiating changes inside of our application. So of course, we do have a good solution. Let's take a look at a diagram that's going to help explain it. So this is how we're going to get the two libraries to work together. We're going to take our Firebase ref and just stick it directly into an action creator. Then whenever the Firebase reference emits a value event, which means some new data has come across over the wire, we're going to turn it into an action and send it off to our reducers. So this first line right here signifies a value event, and a value event. Each value event is going to be turned into an action, and then we're going to send that along or dispatch the action to all of our reducers. The reducers are going to produce new application state, and our React application is then going to render and display some data to our users. So let's try this out in practice. To demo this approach, I'm going to take all the different action creators that I have inside of this existing simple application, which are fetch posts, create post, and delete post, and we're just going to replace these action creators with some Firebase references and watch our application all of a sudden come to life in a very online interactive experience. That sounds like quite a marketing bit right there, but let's give it a shot anyways. So the first thing I'm going to do is import our Firebase library from Firebase. So I've already installed this as an npm module. Next, we're no longer going to be using these list of initial posts right here. Instead, we're going to create our Firebase reference. So we're going to say posts is new Firebase, and this right here is going to point to the very specific URL for the application that I've already created. So you can notice that it's pointing directly at FB Redux right here. So this is our own little slice of data on firebase.com. So we can now listen to this Firebase reference, this post, for a value event. And whenever that value event occurs, we're going to get a snapshot. A snapshot is kind of a reference or our way of peeking into the Firebase data store and seeing what records have been loaded by Firebase. So let's write some code and then talk about exactly what we're doing. I'm going to first work on the fetch post action creator. So right now it was returning this very static list of posts that we just deleted. Instead of doing that, I'm going to return a function here. So we're making use of Redux Thunk, and we can certainly talk more about that later. And I'm going to say whenever I get a value event from Firebase, I'm going to take the snapshot that's provided, and I'm going to dispatch an action of type fetch posts, and the payload is going to be snapshot.val. Snapshot.val is a JSON representation of whatever data was just loaded by Firebase. So here's what's going to happen. When we first boot our application up, we're going to call fetch posts exactly one time. That's going to return this function. Redux Thunk is going to invoke the function and pass in the Redux dispatch method. Then whenever we get a value event from the posts reference from Firebase, we're going to instantly dispatch a new action of type fetch posts with a payload coming from the snapshot. So let's give this a shot in the browser and see what happens. I'm going to refresh, and we instantly get two posts coming in, and these are two existing posts I've already loaded up into Firebase. So it looks like data is successfully coming into our application now. But we still have to address how we create a post and we delete a post. So let's handle both of these cases as well. Let's start with the easier one, which is delete post. So whenever the delete post action creator is called, a key or ID for the very particular record is passed in as an argument. Instead of just returning an action here of type delete post, we're going to replace this with another Redux Thunk function. And inside of here, I'm going to find the post with this very particular key and remove it. Again, this is a reference to our Firebase reference. So in our Firebase reference, find this very particular key and just remove it. So now here's the real magic behind Firebase. When we remove this very particular post here, we're going to automatically get a value event come across the wire. And the value event is going to contain the new list of posts, which omits the one that we just deleted. So let's see what happens when we test this out in the browser. I'm going to refresh. I get my list of posts loaded up. I'm going to delete one. It goes away instantly. I'm going to refresh again, and I'm down to just one post. So this is definitely working out pretty well. Let's take care of the last case here, the case of creating a post. So we're going to take a near identical approach as we did with post.childKeyRemove. But instead of removing, we're instead going to push this post. Remember that with Firebase, this push right here is not actually the array.prototype push that we get with JavaScript. This is saying, hey, push this new bit of data into our database. It's not quite the same as pushing onto an array. So let's now give this a shot in the browser. I'm going to flip back over, refresh the page, and let's say here's a big cup of water. I don't have a lot of existing or interesting posts to say anyways. So let's create the post, and it's instantly added. Again, the very interesting thing here is that we're not really doing anything to update our list of posts. All we're doing is throwing a new list of posts onto the pile. Then the value event is triggered by the Firebase reference that calls our dispatch method and passes a new action with a new list of posts into our Redux reducers. So this looks fantastic. Let's do a quick recap. The challenge of getting Redux and Firebase working together is twofold. First, Firebase pushes their React Fire library as a solution for React applications, which is really inherently incompatible with Redux. Second, Firebase depends on an event-based flow of data, whereas Redux is more about cause and effect. We call an action creator to make a change in our application, and we expect to see one predictable result occur. We melded these two libraries by using Redux Thunk. Using Redux Thunk, every time we get the value event from our Firebase reference, we set a new action off to our reducers that contained our new list of posts. If you like this video, I encourage you to comment or subscribe to get weekly webcasts on interesting topics in the React and JavaScript ecosystem. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.